The scent of wolfsbane hung heavy in the autumn air as Rowan Blackthorn adjusted his silver-lined gloves. The familiar weight of his enchanted blade pressed against his thigh beneath his dark coat. 3 generations of his bloodline had served as witch hunters for the Council of Shadows, and tonight would mark his 27th kill. The last witch of the Crescent Moon coven had been spotted near the ancient oak grove that bordered the mortal realm. And every instinct bred into his werewolf heritage screamed for him to complete the hunt that would finally eradicate the magical threat his kind had sworn to eliminate. The moon cast ethereal light through the canopy above as he moved with predatory silence, his enhanced senses tracking the faint magical signature that pulsed like a heartbeat through the forest. His grandfather had taught him that witches were parasites who drained the natural order, corrupting the sacred balance between wolf and moon with their unnatural spells. His father had died hunting one particularly powerful sorceress, torn apart by shadows that moved like living things, and Rowan had sworn on his grave that no witch would escape his blade. But as he rounded the massive trunk of the centuries-old oak, every assumption he'd held about his prey crumbled like ash in the wind. The witch sat in a circle of glowing herbs, her midnight hair cascading down her shoulders like liquid starlight, and when she raised her eyes to meet his, they held the deep green of ancient forests and the wisdom of countless moons. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, her presence radiating power that felt less like corruption and more like the pure essence of nature itself. "You're early," Lyra Moonwhisper said, her voice carrying the melodic quality of wind chimes and distant thunder. "I expected you'd take longer to track me here." She didn't move from her position, didn't reach for any of the crystalline amulets hanging from her ceremonial belt, and her calm acceptance of his presence sent an unexpected chill down his spine. Rowan's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but something in her expression stopped him. There was no fear in those verdant depths, no desperate attempt to flee or fight, only a profound sadness that seemed to echo through the sacred grove. "You know why I'm here," he said, his voice rougher than intended, the wolf in him responding to her otherworldly presence in ways that defied everything he'd been taught. "To complete your family's legacy," she replied, rising gracefully from her ritual circle, the herbs continuing to glow with soft silver light around her feet. "To eliminate the last practitioner of the old ways and earn your place among the council's most honored hunters." She stepped closer, and he caught her scent wild roses, mixed with rain, and something indefinably magical that made his wolf side restless in ways he'd never experienced. The logical part of his mind screamed warnings, reminding him of his training, his duty, the generations of Blackthorn blood spilled in service to this cause. But as she approached, something deeper stirred within him, an ancient recognition that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to his soul. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his grip on his weapon loosening despite every instinct telling him to strike quickly and end this before whatever spell she was weaving could take hold. "What did you expect?" Lyra asked, stopping just beyond arm's reach, close enough that he could see the faint luminescence that seemed to emanate from her skin, the way her hair moved as if touched by invisible currents of magic. "A cackling crone with twisted features and malevolent intentions? A seductress who would try to enchant you with false promises?" Her laugh held no mockery, only genuine curiosity about the preconceptions that had shaped his worldview. Rowan found himself studying her face, searching for any sign of the evil he'd been conditioned to recognize, but all he saw was intelligence, tempered by sorrow, and a strength that seemed unbreakable despite her apparent vulnerability. "I expected someone who deserved to die," he said quietly, the admission feeling like a betrayal of everything he'd believed about his purpose in this world. "Perhaps I do," she replied, her fingers trailing over one of her amulets, and for a moment the grove seemed to pulse with energy that made his werewolf senses sing with recognition. "My kind has made mistakes, caused harm in our pursuit of knowledge and power. But we've also protected this realm from threats you cannot imagine, maintained barriers between worlds that would tear reality apart if they failed." Her eyes never left his as she spoke, and he found himself captivated by the conviction in her voice. The silver blade felt impossibly heavy at his side as conflicting emotions warred within him. Everything he'd been taught demanded that he complete his mission, that he honor his family's sacrifice by ending the magical threat she represented. But something deeper, something primal and undeniable, whispered that harming her would be the greatest sin he could commit. "Show me," he heard himself say, the words escaping before his rational mind could stop them. Lyra's expression shifted, surprise flickering across her features before being replaced by something that might have been hope. "Show you what?" she asked, though the growing intensity in her gaze suggested she already knew what he was requesting. "Show me the truth," Rowan said, his voice barely above a whisper as he felt the foundation of his beliefs beginning to crumble. "Show me what you really are, what your magic actually does. I need to understand before I—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the action that had brought him here but now seemed impossible to contemplate. Without breaking eye contact, Lyra began to move her hands in intricate patterns, and the air around them shimmered with power that felt ancient and sacred rather than dark and corrupting. The grove itself seemed to respond to her presence, plants growing more vibrant, the very earth beneath their feet humming with renewed life. "This is what we do," she said, as flowers bloomed in her wake, as injured animals emerged from the shadows to be healed by her touch. "We tend the balance, nurture what others would destroy, protect the sacred connections that bind all living things together." Rowan watched in fascination as her magic wove through the natural world, enhancing rather than dominating, healing rather than harming. His werewolf heritage had always made him sensitive to the rhythms of nature, and what he witnessed now felt more right than anything he'd ever experienced. "The Council taught us that magic corrupts everything it touches," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of dawning realization. "Some magic does," Lyra admitted, her power gradually settling back into dormancy as she lowered her hands. "There are practitioners who seek to dominate rather than harmonize, who draw power from pain and fear rather than the willing cooperation of natural forces. But that isn't what the Crescent Moon represents, isn't what I represent." She took another step closer, and this time he didn't retreat, drawn by something that felt like destiny itself. The scent of her magic mixed with her natural fragrance created an intoxicating combination that made his wolf's side pace restlessly beneath his skin. He'd never experienced anything like the pull he felt toward her, a connection that seemed to bypass every defense he'd built around his heart. "My grandfather said that witches were seductresses who used their power to corrupt wolves, to turn us against our own kind," he said, though the words felt hollow now in the face of what he was experiencing. "And yet you feel no compulsion to obey me, no magical influence clouding your judgment," Lyra pointed out, her voice gentle but firm. What you're feeling isn't the result of a spell, Rowan Blackthorn. It's something far more ancient and powerful than any magic I could wield. She reached toward him slowly, giving him time to pull away, but he found himself frozen by the intensity of her gaze. When her fingers brushed against his cheek, skin touching skin for the first time, the world exploded into sensation and understanding that defied description. Images flashed through his mind, memories that weren't his own, emotions that belonged to her but felt as real as his own experiences. He saw her childhood spent learning to heal rather than harm, witnessed the night her coven was slaughtered by hunters who showed no mercy for innocence, felt her years of solitude as she struggled to preserve knowledge that could benefit all of creation. But beneath those shared memories, something else stirred to life between them, a recognition that went deeper than thought or reason. His wolf side, which had been trained to see her as prey, instead recognized something that made every instinct sing with rightness. "Mate," he whispered, the word escaping on a breath that seemed to carry the weight of destiny itself. Lyra's eyes widened, her fingers still pressed against his skin as the same recognition dawned in her expression. "That's impossible," she breathed, but even as she spoke the denial, her magical aura began to resonate with something in him that he'd never known existed. The bond doesn't form between natural enemies, between hunters and their prey. Then maybe we were never meant to be enemies, Rowan said, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested against his face, feeling the electric current of connection that flowed between them. Maybe everything we've been taught about each other is wrong. The thought should have terrified him, should have sent him fleeing back to the familiar certainty of his old beliefs, but instead it felt like waking up from a dream that had never quite made sense. The mate bond, when it formed between werewolves, was said to be unbreakable, a connection that transcended physical attraction or emotional compatibility. It was recognition on a soul level, the universe's way of pairing two beings whose essences complemented each other perfectly. But wolves weren't supposed to bond with witches, weren't supposed to find their perfect match among those they'd been bred to hunt and kill. "The Council will never accept this," Lyra said, though she made no move to pull away from his touch, her magical aura continuing to pulse in harmony with something deep within him. "Your kind has spent centuries teaching hatred for mine, building their power on the systematic elimination of magical practitioners. They won't simply abandon that foundation because of a bond they'll claim is either impossible or the result of dark magic." Rowan knew she was right, knew that returning to his people with tales of a mate bond formed with their greatest enemy would likely result in his own execution alongside hers. But as he looked into her eyes, saw the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide beneath her strength, he realized that the opinion of the Council mattered far less than the rightness of what was happening between them. "Then we don't tell them," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was only beginning to understand. "At least not yet. Not until we figure out what this means, what we're supposed to do with it. You're suggesting I trust the hunter sent to kill me with my life and my secrets," Lyra said, though there was no accusation in her tone, only a wonder that seemed to match his own. "Everything I've been taught tells me that this is exactly the kind of trap I should expect from your kind. Everything I've been taught tells me I should have killed you the moment I laid eyes on you." Rowan countered, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone as he marvelled at the softness of her skin. "But instead, I'm standing here feeling like I've found something I didn't even know I was searching for. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, abandoning the solid ground of everything he'd believed about himself and his purpose. The grove around them seemed to pulse with energy that responded to their connection, plants growing more vibrant, the very air shimmering with magic that felt celebratory rather than threatening. Even the moon above seemed brighter, its light blessing rather than illuminating a hunt that should have ended in death. "The old magic recognizes what's happening between us," Lyra observed, her voice filled with awe as she gestured to the transformed space around them. "This is something beyond my power to create or control." Rowan had felt the change as well, his werewolf senses picking up harmonics in the natural world that spoke of approval and rightness. His wolf side, which should have been howling for blood and violence, instead felt peaceful in a way he'd never experienced. "What happens now?" he asked, the question encompassing not just their immediate situation, but the entire future that had suddenly become possible and impossible in equal measure. "Now we learn," Lyra said, finally stepping back though her fingers lingered against his skin as long as possible. "We discover whether this bond can bridge the gap between our kinds, whether love can overcome generations of hatred and mistrust." She gestured toward a path that led deeper into the grove, toward structures that seemed to be carved from living trees rather than built from dead wood. "My sanctuary isn't far. You could stay, at least for tonight, and we could begin to understand what the universe has given us." The rational part of his mind catalogued all the reasons why following her deeper into what was clearly her stronghold would be the height of foolishness. She could have allies waiting, magical traps prepared, any number of defenses that could turn his moment of vulnerability into his death. But the bond that hummed between them carried its own certainty, a trust that went deeper than logic or training. "Lead the way," he said, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the small of her back as they began to walk together toward whatever future awaited them. The sanctuary that Lyra called home defied every expectation Rowan had harbored about witch lairs and dark magical strongholds. Rather than a twisted parody of nature bent to serve malevolent purposes, he found himself in a space where architecture and living wood had merged so seamlessly that it was impossible to tell where craft ended. Natural growth began. Luminescent fungi provided gentle light, while flowers that bloomed only in moonlight perfumed the air with fragrances that seemed designed to soothe rather than bewitch. "This is beautiful," he said, unable to hide his wonder as they passed through rooms where books floated gently in mid-air, their pages turning of their own accord, as if the knowledge within was eager to be shared. "I expected something more ominous." The admission revealed how thoroughly his preconceptions had been shaped by stories designed to justify violence rather than promote understanding. Lyra's laughter held genuine warmth as she guided him toward what appeared to be a living room, where furniture had been coaxed from still-growing trees and cushions woven from materials that seemed to capture and reflect starlight. "The stories your kind tell about us aren't entirely wrong," she said, settling onto a chair that adjusted its shape to accommodate her perfectly. "There have been witches who chose darkness, who used their power to dominate and destroy, but they were the exception rather than the rule. And their actions shouldn't define all magical practitioners any more than the cruelty of some wolves should condemn your entire species." Rowan took the seat across from her, marveling at how the living wood seemed to welcome his presence rather than merely tolerating it. The Council teaches that magic itself is corrupting, that prolonged exposure to supernatural forces inevitably leads to madness and evil. He said, though even as he spoke the words, they felt hollow in the face of the harmony he sensed all around them. Magic is a tool, Lyra replied, her fingers trailing over an amulet that began to glow with soft silver light. Like any tool, it can be used to create or destroy, to heal or harm. The intention and wisdom of the wielder determines its effect, not some inherent quality of the power itself. She gestured around them, and he could see how her magic had been used to nurture and enhance rather than dominate. I've spent my life learning to work with natural forces rather than against them, to ask rather than demand, to give back more than I take. The bond between them pulsed with something that felt like recognition and approval, as if his wolf side was finally hearing truths it had always known, but been forbidden to acknowledge. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days. Before the hunting began, he said, memories surfacing that he'd buried beneath years of conditioning. She said wolves and witches once worked together, that our kinds were allies rather than enemies. The Pact of Shadows, Lyra confirmed, her expression growing distant as she accessed knowledge passed down through generations of tree. Her lineage. It was formed during the War of Broken Skies, when entities from beyond the veil sought to consume our reality. Wolves provided strength and courage, while witches offered wisdom and magical protection. Together, we drove back the darkness and sealed the barriers that keep our world safe. Her voice carried the weight of ancient history, of truths that had been deliberately forgotten. Rowan felt something shift within him, as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. What changed? Why did the alliance break? He asked, though part of him suspected he already knew the answer, could see the pattern of manipulation and fear that had been used to turn natural allies into bitter enemies. Fear, Lyra said simply, her eyes meeting his across the space between them. Fear of what we didn't understand about each other. Fear of power that could threaten established hierarchies. Fear that cooperation might make both our kinds stronger than those who sought to control us. She paused, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that left brief trails of light. The Council of Shadows didn't exist in the old days. It was formed specifically to break the pact, to convince wolves that witches were their natural enemies rather than their destined allies. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, challenging everything he'd been raised to believe about his heritage and purpose. You're saying my family has been serving those who betrayed our own history, he said, the words feeling like poison on his tongue as the implications began to sink in. Not betrayed, Lyra corrected gently, though her expression held deep sadness for the truth she was revealing. Deceived. The Council used very real threats and very genuine magical corruption to paint all practitioners with the same brush, to make wolves forget that they had once fought alongside magical allies rather than against them. She leaned forward, her hand reaching across the space between them to touch his. Your family believed they were protecting their people, serving a greater good. They couldn't have known they were being manipulated. The contact sent another wave of connection through the bond, and with it came a deeper understanding of the forces that had shaped both their lives. Rowan could feel her certainty that his family had acted from noble intentions, her genuine sorrow for the losses they had suffered in service to a lie. But he could also sense something else. a knowledge she wasn't yet ready to share about the true scope of the Council's deception. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked, his werewolf instincts picking up the subtle signs of concealment, even as the mate bond assured him that whatever she was hiding wasn't meant to harm him. Lyra's grip on his hand tightened, and for a moment her magical aura flickered with something that might have been fear or determination. "There are things about the Council that even they don't fully understand," she said carefully, as if each word was being weighed for its potential consequences. "Powers they serve without knowing the true cost, bargains they've made without understanding the price." She met his eyes, and he could see the conflict between her desire to protect him and her need to prepare him for truths that could change everything. "Tell me," Rowan said, the command carrying the authority of his wolf nature, but tempered by the trust that flowed through their bond. "Whatever it is, I need to know. We both need to understand what we're truly facing." The sanctuary around them seemed to hold its breath as Lyra made her decision, the gentle luminescence of the fungi dimming as if in anticipation of darker revelations. "The entities from beyond the veil that we fought during the War of Broken Skies," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were never truly defeated. They were pushed back, contained, but not destroyed. And the barriers that hold them require constant maintenance, constant renewal from those with the knowledge and power to maintain them." Rowan felt his blood run cold as the implications began to dawn on him. "The Crescent Moon Coven," he said, pieces of a horrifying puzzle falling into place. "You weren't just practitioners of nature magic, you were guardians." "We were the last guardians," Lyra confirmed, tears beginning to track down her cheeks as she spoke truths that had been hidden for generations. Each of the great covens had a sacred duty, a portion of the barriers to maintain and protect. As the hunting began and our numbers dwindled, the remaining covens had to take on greater and greater responsibility. Her voice broke slightly as she continued. "When my sisters fell, when I became the last of our line, I inherited the duty of maintaining barriers that were meant to be shared among dozens of powerful practitioners." The weight of what she was telling him settled on Rowan's shoulders like a physical burden, and with it came a rage that burned hotter than anything he'd ever experienced. The Council hadn't just been manipulating wolves to hunt their natural allies. They'd been systematically destroying the very people responsible for protecting their world from unimaginable threats. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough with barely contained fury. "How long before the barriers fail completely? Without my sisters to share the burden, without the knowledge and power of the other covens, the barriers weaken a little more with each passing moon," Lyra said, her hand tightening on his as if drawing strength from their connection. "I've been holding them alone for 3 years now, since the last of my coven sisters fell to hunters' blades. I estimate perhaps 6 months before the first breaks, maybe a year before they all collapse." The magnitude of the catastrophe they were facing made his previous concerns about council acceptance and social consequences seem trivial by comparison. If Lyra died, if her knowledge and power were lost, their entire reality would be exposed to entities that viewed mortal existence as nothing more than sustenance to be consumed. "The Council has to be warned," he said, though even as he spoke he could see the impossibility of the situation. "Warned with what proof?" Lyra asked, though her tone held no mockery for his suggestion. "Everything I've told you goes against generations of their teaching, challenges the very foundation of their power and authority. They'll claim it's lies designed to save my life, Manipulation meant to turn their best hunter against them. She gestured around the sanctuary, and he could see the subtle signs of strain in the way her magic flickered and wavered. Even if they believed me, the knowledge of how to maintain the barriers was split among the covens for safety. I have my piece, but not the whole. Restoring the full protection would require practitioners from bloodlines they've already exterminated. Rowan stood abruptly, pacing to the window where moonlight streamed through glass that seemed to be made from crystallized starlight. The bonds of duty and family loyalty that had defined his entire existence warred with the mate bond that demanded he protect Lyra at any cost. And beneath both was a growing certainty that the world as he knew it was built on foundations of sand and lies. There has to be something we can do, he said, his reflection in the magical glass showing a man whose certainty had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a single evening. There is, Lyra said quietly, and when he turned back to her, he could see resolution forming in her expression, like steel being forged in flame. The barriers were designed to be renewed through ritual that requires both magical knowledge and the raw power that comes from deep connection to natural forces. A witch working alone, even one with my training and bloodline, can only delay the inevitable. But a witch working in partnership with a wolf, with someone whose connection to the natural world comes from an entirely different source. Oh. She let the implication hang in the air between them. You're talking about using the mate bond, Rowan said, understanding dawning like sunrise after the darkest night. Using our connection to combine our different types of power. The old records speak of such partnerships, Lyra confirmed, rising from her chair to approach him with steps that seemed to dance in harmony with the magic that permeated her sanctuary. Witch and wolf working as one, their combined power greater than the sum of its parts. It was how the barriers were first created, how they were maintained for centuries, before fear and manipulation tore our kinds apart. The possibility she was describing offered hope where there had been none, but it also meant abandoning everything he'd been raised to believe about his duty and his people. The council will see it as the ultimate betrayal, he said, though he could already feel his wolf side embracing the rightness of what she was proposing. Working with you, bonding my power to yours, would make me everything they've taught their hunters to despise. Yes, Lyra said simply, stopping close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin and see the flecks of silver in her green eyes. It would also make you the most important person in the world, the one individual with the power to prevent an apocalypse that would consume everything and everyone you've ever cared about. The choice before him was stark in its clarity, even as it was impossible in its implications. He could return to the council, report his failure to eliminate the last witch, and watch as the barriers slowly collapsed and reality itself became a feeding ground for entities beyond mortal comprehension. Or he could trust the bond that sang between them, embrace a partnership that went against everything he'd been taught, and risk becoming an outcast from his own people in order to save them. "Show me," he said, the words carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape not just his own destiny, but the fate of their entire world. "Show me how we can work together, how our power can combine to strengthen the barriers." Lyra's smile held relief and gratitude and something deeper that made his heart race in ways that had nothing to do with fear. "The ritual is complex, and it will forge a connection between us that goes even deeper than the mate bond," she warned, though her magical aura was already beginning to resonate with anticipation. "Once we begin, There will be no going back to the way things were. We'll be bound not just by fate, but by choice, partners in magic as well as in life. Then we'll face the consequences together, Rowan said, reaching for her hands and feeling the electric current of their connection intensify as their fingers intertwined. Whatever happens, whatever the council or anyone else thinks about what we're doing, we'll know that we chose to protect rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. The sanctuary around them seemed to pulse with approval as Lyra led him toward a chamber deeper within the living structure, where ancient symbols carved into wood that had never been cut glowed with their own inner light. The ritual space felt sacred in a way that transcended any single religious tradition, speaking to something fundamental about the connection between all living things and the forces that bound reality together. The combining of witch and wolf power requires absolute trust, Lyra explained as she began gathering materials that seemed to have been waiting for this moment for centuries. You'll need to open your mind completely, allow me access to the deepest parts of your magical nature, while sharing access to mine. Any hesitation, any doubt or fear could cause the ritual to fail or worse. Rowan watched her preparations with fascination and growing certainty that this was what he'd been meant to do with his life, that all his training and hunting had been preparation for this moment, when he would finally serve his true purpose. "I trust you," he said, the simple words carrying more weight than any oath or vow he'd ever spoken. "With my life, with my power, with whatever future we can build together." The ritual began with them sitting across from each other in a circle of herbs and crystals that seemed to capture and amplify the moonlight, streaming through windows carved into the living walls. Lyra's voice rose and fell in cadences that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to his wolf soul, words and languages that predated human civilization, calling upon forces that had shaped the calm world from its very beginning. As her magic began to weave around them, Rowan felt his own power responding in ways he'd never experienced, the strength and ferocity of his wolf nature flowing outward to meet and merge with her more subtle but equally potent abilities. The sensation was indescribable, like being turned inside out while simultaneously discovering parts of himself he'd never known existed. Through their growing connection, he could feel how memories and experiences, as if they were his own, could understand the weight of knowledge and responsibility she'd carried alone for so long. In return, he sensed her surprise and wonder at experiencing the raw primal power of his werewolf heritage, the way his connection to natural forces was immediate and instinctive, rather than learned and refined. "Now," Lyra whispered, her voice seeming to come from both outside and inside his consciousness as the ritual reached its crescendo. "Reach out with me, feel for the barriers that hold back the darkness. Let our combined power flow into them, strengthen them, renew them as they were meant to be renewed." Rowan stretched his awareness beyond the confines of his individual existence, following the flow of their merged magic as it sought out the ancient defenses that surrounded their reality. When he found them, the barriers felt like gossamer threads stretched to their breaking point, so fragile that a strong wind might snap them entirely. But as their combined power flowed into the weakened defenses, he felt them solidify and strengthen, regaining stability they hadn't possessed in decades. The process was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, requiring every ounce of focus and determination they possessed. But when it was complete, when the barriers once again stood strong against the entities that pressed against them from beyond the veil, Rowan felt a satisfaction deeper than anything he'd ever experienced through hunting or fighting. "It's done," Lyra said, though her voice was weak with exhaustion and her magical aura flickered like a candle in strong wind. "The barriers will hold now, at least for a while, long enough for us to figure out what comes next." Rowan gathered her into his arms as she swayed with fatigue, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how right it felt to hold her close and share his strength when hers was depleted. "How long?" he asked, needing to understand the scope of what they'd accomplished and what would be required going forward. "Perhaps a year, maybe 2, if we're fortunate," she replied, her head resting against his shoulder as if she belonged there. "But the ritual will need to be repeated regularly, and each time will require both of us working together. The barriers were never meant to be maintained by just 2 people, no matter how well matched." The implications of what she was telling him were both hopeful and daunting. They'd proven that the partnership between witch and wolf could work, that their combined power was sufficient to maintain the defenses that protected their world, that they'd also committed themselves to a lifetime of secret rituals, of hiding their true purpose from people who would see their cooperation as betrayal rather than salvation. "We'll find a way," Rowan said, his voice carrying the conviction of the mate bond and the determination of someone who'd finally found his true calling. "We'll find others who can understand, who can help us carry this burden. And if we can't, then we'll bear it alone together." Lyra lifted her head to look at him, and in her eyes he saw the same mixture of hope and determination that filled his own heart. "Together," she agreed, and when she kissed him, it felt like sealing a pact that went beyond romance or even love, a commitment to stand against the darkness no matter what the cost. The weeks that followed their bonding and first barrier ritual were a strange mixture of domestic tranquility and growing tension as Rowan struggled to maintain his cover while learning to navigate his new reality. He'd reported to the council that the witch had eluded him, that her trail had gone cold in the deep forest, buying them time to establish their partnership without immediate scrutiny. But he knew that his failure to complete such an important hunt would eventually raise questions that would be difficult to answer. Living with Lyra in her sanctuary had opened his eyes to aspects of magic he'd never imagined, ways that power could be used to nurture and protect rather than dominate and destroy. He watched her tend to injured animals that sought her help, observed her careful cultivation of herbs and flowers that seemed to thrive under her attention, learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated the health of the barriers they worked together to maintain. "The council will expect another report soon," he said one morning as they shared breakfast of fruits and herbs grown in her magical garden, food that seemed to nourish not just his body, but his spirit as well. "And eventually they'll want to know why I've been away from headquarters for so long without concrete results." Lyra looked up from the ancient tome she'd been consulting, her expression thoughtful as she considered the practical challenges of maintaining their deception. "Perhaps it's time to give them a different kind of result," she suggested, her fingers tracing symbols on the page that seemed to shift and change as he watched. "Something that would explain your extended absence while providing information they'd find valuable." "What do you mean?" Rowan asked, though he could see from her expression that she was forming a plan that would require careful consideration and possibly significant risk. "The corruption I mentioned before, the magical practitioners who chose darkness over light," Lyra explained, closing the book and giving him her full attention. They're still out there, still posing genuine threats to both our kinds. If you were to help me track down and eliminate some of them, it would give you concrete victories to report while also serving the greater good. The suggestion was both brilliant and dangerous, offering a way for them to work together openly while maintaining their cover stories. But it would also put them in contact with genuinely dangerous magical practitioners, witches who had chosen the path of corruption and would likely view their partnership as either an opportunity to exploit or a threat. Eliminate. These practitioners you're talking about, Rowan said, his hunter instincts already analysing the tactical implications of what she was proposing. How dangerous are they? What kind of threats are we talking about? Lyra's expression grew grim as she accessed memories and knowledge passed down through generations of her bloodline. Necromancers who raise the dead to serve their will, blood mages who drain life force to fuel their spells, summoners who make pacts with entities from beyond the veil in exchange for power they can't control. She said, her voice heavy with distaste for practitioners who had perverted the gifts they'd been given. They're everything the Council believes all witches to be, and their actions make it easier for people to justify hatred for all magical practitioners. The irony wasn't lost on Rowan that hunting genuinely corrupt witches alongside his mate would provide better cover for their relationship than any lie he could tell the Council. How do we find them? He asked, already beginning to plan how they could present their partnership as a practical alliance rather than the deep emotional and magical bond it truly was. The same way you found me, Lyra replied with a smile that held both warmth and dangerous promise. We track their magical signatures, follow the trail of their corrupted workings, and eliminate them before they can cause more harm. She paused, her expression growing more serious. But unlike hunting me, hunting them will be genuinely dangerous. They'll fight back with everything they have, and they won't hesitate to use forbidden magic that could destroy us both. Their first hunt together took them to the ruins of an abandoned monastery where reports of unnatural deaths and strange lights had drawn the attention of both the Council and Lyra's magical senses. The necromancer they tracked had been raising corpses from the ancient cemetery, using the animated dead to terrorize nearby villages, while he experimented with increasingly dark magic. Can you sense how many? Rowan asked, as they approached the crumbling stone walls, his enhanced hearing picking up sounds that definitely weren't made by living throats. Lyra closed her eyes, extending her magical awareness into the ruins ahead of them. 12 animated corpses, maybe 15, she reported, her voice tight with disgust at the perversion of natural death she was sensing. And one very powerful necromancer who's been feeding on death energy for months. She opened her eyes to meet his gaze. This won't be like facing an ordinary witch. He's transformed himself into something that's barely human anymore. Working together, they were a formidable team, in ways that surprised them both. Rowan's werewolf strength and speed complemented Lyra's magical abilities perfectly, allowing him to destroy the animated corpses, while she focused her power on unraveling the necromancer's hold over death itself. When they finally confronted the corrupt practitioner, he was indeed more monster than man, his features twisted by the dark magic he'd consumed and his eyes burning with unnatural hunger. A wolf working with a witch, the necromancer hissed, his voice carrying the echo of grave dirt and decay. How deliciously ironic. The Council's perfect hunter seduced by the very prey he was meant to eliminate. His laughter was like the sound of bones breaking, and the air around him shimmered with power that made both their supernatural senses recoil. I haven't been seduced, Rowan replied, his silver blade gleaming in the moonlight as he moved to flank their enemy. "I've been educated. There's a difference between a witch who serves life and one who perverts death." The battle that followed was brutal and decisive, with Lyra using her knowledge of natural forces to counter the necromancer's death magic, while Rowan's physical prowess kept the creature from overwhelming her with sheer, malevolent power. When it was over, when the necromancer's corrupted form had crumbled to dust and his animated servants had returned to proper rest, they stood together in the ruins feeling both victorious and sobered by the genuine evil they'd faced. "This is what the council should be hunting," Lyra said, her magical aura still flickering with the aftermath of the power she'd channeled. "Practitioners who corrupt the gift of magic, who use it to harm rather than heal." She looked around at the monastery that was already beginning to feel more peaceful, the oppressive weight of necromantic energy lifting like fog before dawn. "Not those of us who work to maintain the balance." Rowan nodded, understanding now why the stories of witch corruption had such power over his people's imagination. Facing a genuinely evil magical practitioner was terrifying in ways that went beyond ordinary physical danger, touching on primal fears about death and the violation of natural order. "The council needs to learn the difference," he said, though he knew how difficult it would be to convince people who had been taught that all magic was inherently corrupting. They returned to her sanctuary with evidence of their success and a story that would satisfy the council's need for results while concealing the true nature of their partnership. Rowan would report that he'd convinced the witch to assist him in hunting more dangerous practitioners, a temporary alliance that benefited both their goals. It wasn't technically a lie, even if it omitted the most important truths about their relationship. Over the following months, they established a pattern that served multiple purposes. They would seek out and eliminate genuinely corrupt magical practitioners, providing Rowan with victories to report to the council while making their world genuinely safer. Between hunts, they would perform the rituals necessary to maintain the barriers, their combined power growing stronger and more harmonious with each working. And through it all, their personal relationship deepened into something that transcended the mere physical attraction of the mate bond. "Tell me about your family," Lyra said one evening as they sat together in her garden, watching stars that seemed brighter than they had any right to be. "Not the hunting stories, not the council's version of your heritage. Tell me about the people who raised you, who shaped who you became." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, sifting through memories he'd kept buried beneath years of duty and purpose. "My grandmother was the one who really raised me," he finally said, his voice soft with affection for a woman who'd been gone for over a decade. "My parents were always away on council business, hunting or training or attending meetings. But my grandmother told different stories, sang old songs that went back generations before the hunting began." "What kind of songs?" Lyra asked, shifting closer to him on the bench they shared, her presence a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "Lullabies about wolves who danced with the moon, ballads about heroes who fought alongside magical allies, love songs about bonds that transcended the barriers between different kinds of beings." Rowan recalled, surprised by how clearly he could remember words he hadn't thought about in years. "She always said they were just old stories, but now I wonder if she was trying to teach me something the council didn't want me to know." Lyra smiled, her fingers finding his in the darkness between them. "She sounds like she was very wise," she said, And through their bond, he could feel her genuine warmth for a woman she'd never met, but who had helped shape the man she'd come to love. Would she have approved of us, do you think? I think she would have said it was about time, Rowan replied, surprised by his own certainty about what a dead woman would have thought of his current situation. She always told me I was too serious, too focused on duty, and not enough on living. She would have liked seeing me happy. Their conversation was interrupted by a disturbance in the magical currents that surrounded the sanctuary, a wrongness that set both their supernatural senses on high alert. Lyra was on her feet immediately, her hands moving in patterns that activated the defensive wards built into her home's living structure. "What is it?" Rowan asked, his own instincts telling him that something dangerous was approaching, but unable to identify the specific nature of the threat. "Hunters," Lyra said, her voice grim as she accessed the magical early warning system she'd woven throughout the forest. 3 of them, moving with purpose toward the sanctuary. They know exactly where they're going. She met his eyes, and he could see both fear and determination in her expression. "Someone told them where to find me." Rowan's blood ran cold as the implications hit him. Either his cover story had been discovered, or someone else had been watching them, tracking their movements and reporting back to the council. Either way, their carefully constructed deception was about to come crashing down around them. "Can we run?" he asked, though he already knew from her expression that flight wasn't an option. "The barriers," Lyra replied simply, her hands already moving to gather materials for what he recognized as combat magic, rather than the nurturing spells he'd grown accustomed to seeing. "If I leave now, if I'm not here to maintain them, they'll begin to weaken immediately. We can't abandon our responsibility just to save ourselves." The approaching hunters were skilled, Rowan realized as he monitored their advance through the forest. They moved with the coordinated precision of a team that had worked together many times, and their scents carried the metallic tang of silver weapons and the bitter herbs used to ward against magical influence. These weren't novices sent to test a suspected traitor, they were elite operatives sent to eliminate a known threat. "They'll have orders to kill us both," he said, checking his own weapons while trying to calculate odds that didn't look favourable. "The Council doesn't send teams like this for capture missions. Then we make our stand here," Lyra declared, her magical aura beginning to pulse with power that transformed the peaceful sanctuary into something that felt more like a fortress preparing for siege. "Whatever happens, we protect what we've built together, and the greater purpose we serve." The first arrow came from the darkness beyond the garden, its silver tip designed to penetrate magical defenses and deliver toxins lethal to supernatural beings. Rowan's werewolf reflexes allowed him to dodge, but the message was clear: negotiation wasn't an option. The battle that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. The attacking hunters coordinated their assault with precision born of extensive training, using weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter both werewolf abilities and magical defenses. But Rowan and Lyra had advantages their enemies couldn't have anticipated, powers that worked in harmony rather than simply side by side. When one hunter tried to flank Lyra while she was focused on countering magical attacks from another, Rowan's wolf senses allowed him to intercept the threat before it could reach her. When silver nets designed to contain his werewolf form threatened to overwhelm his physical defenses, her magic unraveled the enchantments that held them together. They moved as one unit, their bond allowing them to anticipate each other's actions and respond to threats with perfect coordination. But even working together, they were outnumbered and facing opponents who had been specifically prepared for this confrontation. As the battle wore on, it became clear that they couldn't win through simple combat. They needed something that would change the fundamental nature of the conflict. "The binding ritual," Lyra called out during a brief lull in the fighting, her voice carrying clearly to his ears despite the chaos around them. "If we can complete the full bonding, our combined power will be more than they can handle." Rowan understood immediately what she was proposing, though the risks were enormous. The complete mate bonding between witch and wolf was irreversible and would create a magical signature that no amount of deception could conceal. Once they underwent the full ritual, hiding their relationship from the council would be impossible. "Do it," he said, without hesitation, his trust in her absolute, even as he knew they were crossing a line that would transform them both forever. The ritual began even as they continued to fight, Lyra's voice rising in ancient words that seemed to resonate through the fabric of reality itself. Power flowed between them in ways that transcended their previous cooperation, merging not just their abilities, but their very essences, until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The transformation was visible to their attackers, who fell back in apparent confusion as the two figures they'd been fighting became something entirely new and unprecedented. The combined magical signature of witch and wolf, working in perfect harmony, created phenomena that had never been recorded in council archives, power that operated according to rules their enemies didn't understand. When the transformation was complete, when Rowan and Lyra had become something greater than the sum of their individual selves, the hunters found themselves facing not two separate opponents, but a single entity whose power drew from both the raw strength of werewolf nature and the refined wisdom of magical tradition. The conflict ended quickly after that, with their attackers recognizing that they were overmatched and retreating into the darkness from which they'd come. "They'll report what they saw," Lyra said, as they stood together in the aftermath, her hand in his, as they both marveled at the new depth of connection that flowed between them. "The council will know exactly what we've become, what we represent." Rowan nodded, feeling strangely peaceful, despite the certainty that their secret was now exposed and their lives would never be simple again. "Let them know," he said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had finally stopped running from his true nature. "Let them see that witch and wolf can work together, that we're stronger united than we ever were apart." The weeks following their complete bonding brought changes that neither of them had fully anticipated. The enhanced connection between them allowed for communication that transcended words, sharing of memories and emotions that created an intimacy deeper than anything either had imagined possible. But it also marked them as something unprecedented, beings whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which their society was built. News of their bonding spread through both the council's networks and the scattered remnants of magical communities with equal speed, generating reactions that ranged from fascination to outrage to careful interest. Some viewed their partnership as an abomination that violated natural law, while others saw it as a return to older traditions that had been forgotten rather than truly lost. "There are others," Lyra told him one morning as she reviewed correspondence that had begun arriving at their sanctuary from unexpected sources. "Witches who survived the hunts by hiding their nature, wolves who questioned the council's teachings but never had the courage to voice their doubts. They're reaching out, asking if what we've achieved could be replicated. Rowan read over her shoulder, amazed by the number of messages from people he'd never suspected of harboring sympathies for their cause. Some of these names, he said, recognizing colleagues and acquaintances among the senders. I worked with these people, trusted them to watch my back in dangerous situations. I never knew they had doubts about the council's mission. Fear makes people hide their true beliefs, Lyra observed, though her tone carried hope rather than condemnation. But seeing that someone else has taken the risk, proven that another way is possible, sometimes that's enough to give others the courage to step forward. The transformation of their sanctuary into something resembling a meeting place for supernatural dissidents happened gradually but inevitably. Wolves who had grown tired of hunting people, whose only crime was being different, began making pilgrimages to speak with them. Witches who had spent years in hiding emerged to share knowledge and seek fellowship with others who understood their burden. Even some humans who had discovered the supernatural world began finding their way to the sanctuary, drawn by stories of a place where different kinds of beings could coexist peacefully. We're becoming something we never intended, Rowan said one evening, as they watched a group of visitors sharing stories around a fire that burned without consuming the living wood it rested upon. Not just partners working to maintain the barriers, but symbols of what supernatural cooperation could look like. Lyra leaned against his shoulder, her presence still creating that sense of completeness that had become as necessary to him as breathing. Perhaps that's what was always meant to happen, she replied thoughtfully. Perhaps the barriers were just the beginning, the first step toward rebuilding the alliances that were broken by fear and manipulation. The inevitable confrontation with the council came on a night when the autumn air carried the promise of winter, and the moon hung full and bright above the forest canopy. They arrived in force this time, dozens of elite hunters accompanied by council members whose authority extended across the entire supernatural hierarchy. But they came under a flag of truce, requesting dialogue rather than demanding surrender. Rowan Blackthorn, called out Commander Magnus Ironclad, a wolf whose family had served the council for even longer than Rowan's own lineage. You will answer for your betrayal of everything our kind holds sacred. I'll answer for my choices, Rowan replied, stepping forward with Lyra at his side, their combined presence radiating power that made several of the assembled hunters take involuntary steps backward. But I won't apologize for discovering that our entire worldview was built on lies. The debate that followed stretched through the night, with accusations and justifications flying between the two sides as fundamental beliefs were challenged and defended. The council's representatives maintained that magical practitioners were inherently dangerous, that the systematic elimination of witches was necessary to protect their world from corruption and chaos. Rowan and Lyra presented evidence of the barriers, proof that witches had been protecting rather than threatening their reality, testimony from practitioners who had dedicated their lives to serving the greater good. Even if what you claim is true, Magnus finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of implications he clearly didn't want to accept, you cannot expect us to simply abandon generations of teaching and tradition. The hunting of witches has defined our purpose for centuries. Then find a new purpose, Lyra interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years maintaining defenses that protected everyone present. Help us identify and eliminate the practitioners who genuinely threaten innocent people. Work with us to strengthen the barriers that keep our world safe from entities that would consume everything you claim to protect." The moment of silence that followed her words stretched long enough for Rowan to hope that reason might prevail over prejudice, that the evidence they'd presented might be sufficient to change minds that had been closed for generations. But when Magnus spoke again, his voice carried the finality of a decision that had already been made. "The Council has voted," he announced, his words echoing through the forest with the weight of official proclamation. "You will both be executed as traitors to the natural order, and any who shelter you will face the same fate." The attack that followed was swift and coordinated, dozens of hunters moving with precision born of extensive planning and preparation. But they had underestimated both the power that flowed from the complete bonding between witch and wolf, and the allies who had gathered at the sanctuary over the preceding weeks. The battle became a three-way conflict, with council forces facing not just Rowan and Lyra, but a coalition of supernatural beings who had grown tired of living under the thumb of organization that claimed to represent them while systematically oppressing anyone who didn't conform to their narrow definition of acceptable behavior. The tide of battle turned when the barriers themselves began to respond to the conflict, reacting to the threat posed to their guardians by manifesting phenomena that none of the combatants had expected. Entities from beyond the veil, held back by defenses that Rowan and Lyra had strengthened, began to press against the weakening barriers as the magical energy expended in combat drew their attention and hunger. "Do you see?" Lyra called out, as shadows that belonged to no natural source began seeping through cracks in reality itself. "This is what happens when the barriers fail. This is what we've been protecting you from." The appearance of genuine otherworldly threats had an immediate effect on the conflict, as hunters who had been trying to kill the sanctuary's defenders suddenly found themselves fighting alongside them, against enemies that threatened everyone equally. The entities that managed to breach the weakened barriers were nightmarish creatures that viewed all mortal existence as nothing more than sustenance, making no distinction between witch, wolf, or human in their hunger for consumption. Working together, the combined forces were able to drive back the invasion and repair the damaged barriers, but the cost was significant and the lesson unmistakable. The Council's attempt to eliminate the barrier guardians had nearly resulted in the very catastrophe they claimed to be preventing. "The barriers require constant maintenance," Magnus admitted, as they stood amid the aftermath of the battle, his expression showing a man whose entire worldview had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a single night. "And you're telling us that only certain bloodlines have the knowledge necessary to perform that maintenance? Bloodlines that your organization has spent centuries systematically exterminating," Rowan confirmed, his voice carrying no satisfaction at being proven right. "We've been working to preserve what knowledge remains, but it's not enough. We need more practitioners, more diversity of magical tradition, if we're going to maintain the defenses long term." The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes heated, but they ultimately resulted in agreements that transformed the fundamental relationship between supernatural communities. The Council would cease its blanket persecution of magical practitioners, instead working to identify and eliminate only those who posed genuine threats. In return, surviving witches would share their knowledge of barrier maintenance and work openly with wolf allies to strengthen the defenses that protected their shared reality. "Change won't happen overnight," Lyra warned, as they watched the first joint patrols of hunters and witches preparing to seek out genuinely corrupt practitioners. "There's too much history, Too much mistrust on both sides. We'll face opposition from those who benefit from the old divisions. Rowan nodded, understanding that their work was far from over even as they celebrated this initial victory. But we've proven that cooperation is possible, he said, his arm tightening around her waist, as they stood together, watching a future neither had dared to imagine becoming reality around them. We've shown that witch and wolf can work together, that our combined strength is greater than our individual power. The months that followed brought challenges and victories in equal measure as the new alliance struggled to overcome centuries of conditioning and mistrust. There were setbacks when extremists on both sides attempted to sabotage the cooperation. Moments when it seemed like fear and hatred might triumph over the fragile hope they had built. But there were also successes that validated their faith in the possibility of change. Corrupt practitioners eliminated through joint operations, barriers strengthened by teams that combined different types of magical knowledge, communities that began to heal from generations of division and conflict. The spring ritual will be the most complex we've ever attempted, Lyra said, as they prepared for a barrier renewal that would involve dozens of practitioners from different traditions working in harmony. If we can make it work, if we can successfully integrate all these different approaches to magic, it will prove that the old alliance can be truly restored. Rowan watched the preparations with amazement and growing confidence, seeing how naturally the various supernatural beings worked together when they focused on their common goals rather than their historical differences. "Look at them," he said, gesturing toward a group where wolves and witches shared techniques and knowledge as if the centuries of hunting had never happened. "This is what we were meant to be, what we could have been all along if fear hadn't driven us apart." The ritual itself was a masterpiece of cooperation and magical harmony, with each participant contributing their unique strengths to a working that strengthened the barriers beyond anything that had been achieved since the original Pact of Shadows. When it was complete, when the defenses stood stronger than they had in generations, the assembled practitioners felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended individual achievement. "We did it," Lyra whispered as they stood together in the aftermath, her hand in his as they felt the renewed stability of the barriers through their enhanced connection. "We actually did it. The alliance is real again." Rowan pulled her close, marveling at how far they had come from that night in the oak grove, when he had been sent to kill her and instead found his mate and his true purpose. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had glimpsed the potential for a better future and was determined to make it reality. "We've shown that change is possible, but now we have to make it permanent, make it something that can survive even when we're no longer here to guide it." Years passed as they worked to build institutions and traditions that would preserve the alliance they had forged, training new generations of supernatural beings to see cooperation as natural rather than quarrel. Revolutionary. The sanctuary became a school where young wolves and witches learned together, where the artificial divisions that had defined their parents' lives were replaced by friendships and partnerships that promised a different kind of future. "Sometimes I still can't believe it worked," Lyra said one evening as they sat in their garden watching students practice joint magical workings that would have been unthinkable when they first met. "When you found me that night, when I saw a hunter approaching with silver weapons and deadly intent, I never imagined that you would become the key to saving everything I cared about." Rowan smiled, his own amazement at their journey never completely fading despite the years that had passed since their first meeting. "I was so certain I knew what I was hunting," he replied, his arm drawing her closer as they watched the next generation embrace possibilities their parents had been forced to fight for. I thought I was tracking an enemy, a threat to everything I'd sworn to protect. Instead, I found my mate, my partner, my other half. The mate bond between them had deepened and evolved over the years, becoming something that transcended the magical connection that had first brought them together. They had built a love based on shared purpose and mutual respect, on the recognition that they were stronger together than either could ever be alone. Their partnership had become the foundation for changes that rippled through the entire supernatural world, proof that even the deepest divisions could be healed when people chose understanding over hatred. "The barriers are stable," Lyra observed, her magical senses confirming what they both knew from their regular monitoring rituals. "Stronger than they've been in centuries, maintained by practitioners from dozens of different traditions working in harmony. Our children will inherit a world where such cooperation is taken for granted rather than fought for." Their children, when they came, would indeed grow up in a transformed world where the artificial boundaries between supernatural communities had been replaced by alliances based on mutual benefit and shared responsibility. They would learn about the old divisions as history rather than current reality, understand the hunting years as a cautionary tale about what happened when fear was allowed to override wisdom. "Do you ever regret it?" Rowan asked as they prepared for bed in the quarters they had built together, rooms that reflected both their natures in perfect harmony. "Giving up the life you planned, the solitary existence you thought you wanted, to build something completely different with someone you were raised to hate?" Lyra turned to face him, her expression holding all the love and certainty that had sustained them through years of struggle and triumph. "Never," she said without hesitation, her hands framing his face as she spoke words that carried the weight of absolute truth. "You saved me from more than death that night in the grove. You saved me from a lifetime of loneliness, from bearing responsibilities that were never meant to be carried alone. You gave me a partner, a future, a chance to be part of something greater than myself." "You gave me the same," Rowan replied, his voice rough with emotion as he remembered the empty years before he had found his true purpose. "I thought duty and honor meant following orders without question, serving causes I never truly understood. You taught me that real honor comes from protecting what matters, from choosing love over hatred even when it's difficult." As they settled into sleep, surrounded by the peaceful energy of their sanctuary and the knowledge that their work would continue through the students and allies they had trained, both felt the deep satisfaction that came from lives lived in service to something greater than themselves. They had taken the hatred and division they inherited and transformed it into love and cooperation that would endure long after they were gone. The story of the hunter who fell in love with his prey, of the witch who chose trust over vengeance, became legend among the supernatural communities they had helped unite. It was told around fires, where wolves and witches shared stories as friends, taught in schools where young people learned that differences in nature and ability were sources of strength rather than division, remembered in rituals where diverse practitioners worked together to maintain the barriers that protected all life from threats beyond mortal comprehension. In the end, their love had indeed conquered the hatred they were raised to feel, proving that even the deepest conditioning could be overcome by recognition of shared humanity and common purpose. They had found in each other not just mates but partners in the truest sense, individuals whose combined strength had reshaped their world and created possibilities that neither could have achieved alone. The barriers held strong, maintained by an alliance that had been forged in conflict but tempered by cooperation. The hunting years became history, replaced by an era of partnership that honored the best aspects of both traditions while rejecting the worst. And, at the heart of it all, was the bond between witch and wolf. The love that had grown from the most unlikely of meetings into the foundation for a transformed world where difference was celebrated rather than feared, where cooperation replaced conflict, and where the future held promise rather than threat for all who called their reality home.